All right, here's a thing we're going to record that nobody may ever see, and we're going to talk about why the cloud sucks.
Why does the cloud suck, Kurt?
Well, there are a lot of clouds. Usually, I'm lamenting when I say the cloud sucks. It's AWS, and its competitors, Azure and GCP, are just AWS again. Honestly, I think those clouds suck for me because I'm a developer. I'm not like a person who wants to operate cloud components. I'd rather just build apps and make them run, like put them somewhere.
I think that's a lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's not really what those clouds are for. And so the net effect is that if I launch like, I don't know, a Next app or a Rails app or a Phoenix app, as I would do lately, like it's actually, I don't even know where to start with this necessarily on AWS at this point. Like they have a catalog of like 400 products. You probably only need 3 of them, but you just got to figure out which ones and how to string them together. And there's some good stuff in there. It's really high ceremony to use those things. It's just like, for like a Phoenix app on AWS, you're going to need a VPC, which will give you by default these days. You need to know what a VPC is. You need probably either a Fargate or their Kubernetes setup to run the actual application. You need RDS. You need an Elastic Load Balancer or an application load balancer running in front of it.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that you have to fit together, and it's very fitting that you have the word Tetris in the background. So.
Yes, right? I do love my Tetris.
Almost like we planned
Tetris
that.
only has 4 blocks, though. It's way less complicated.
Way less complicated.
Yeah, and on the other end of that, you've got the Heroku effect, which is like you can get a Rails app running, and this is like 2008. I was really excited about this. You can get a Rails app running really fast, as long as it's Rails and as long as it uses Postgres, and as soon as you need to do something else, you're like back in the AWS quagmire. There's this gamut, I think, of like people call it like infrastructure as a service, is like the public clouds. That's way too complicated for a small group of developers to move fast with. And then there's the developer focused platforms that are in a lot of ways like so restricted that when your app gets interesting, you have to either partially move off or entirely move off one of those things.
Yeah, I feel like that's the sort of the standard effect of anything that's built on top of infrastructure, where they're like, okay, we've got everything covered. Except for if you need that one extra little piece of control, and then all of a sudden you have to learn how to do everything from scratch.
So yes, I hate clouds.
Okay, but we're a cloud.
We are a cloud.
We're a cloud. What's up? Why do you hate us so much, Kurt?
We have some of the same problems. I think one of the interesting problems with the clouds is that they're actually kind of relatively expensive compared to just buying a piece of hardware and sticking it somewhere. What we have to do is buy probably a more expensive server with things like ECC, error correcting RAM, with like enterprise NVMEs in them, with more expensive CPUs, and then we have to charge basically a 70% markup on those things. I guess that's backwards. We have to get 100% margin, so it's actually almost like 3 times as much as we're paying. So that same server, like we can only operate as a business if we're selling that for $600 a month to people.
Obviously, yeah, you can have your own server and do everything yourself in your basement, but there's drawbacks. Right. So
one of the reasons cloud sucks is there's like a quality bar we're all trying to hit to make sure things work as well as possible for customers, which also sets this like price floor. It's like you just can't be really cheap as a cloud and operate as a business, and then build all the software to do all these things. And so it's That's just like I don't know. It's sort of a trade-off thing. It is more expensive, but less expensive than like paying people to run servers for you.
Yeah, there's always a price to abstraction, right? It just depends on, how much do you want to scale and how much is it worth to you that other people do the stuff that you don't want to do that becomes cumbersome. So. And
we're talking right now when DHH, the old Rails curmudgeon, put up a slide at his Rails conference thing. Oh boy, he's got some funny slides. He's got things like someone pulling the hood off Vercel like it's Scooby-Doo, and there's a AWS plus 500% markup.
Yeah.
This is actually an interesting, I think some of the modern clouds, Roku had this problem. There's the bare metal, there's AWS on top of it that has their markup, and then they have to charge even again on top of AWS to make this stuff sustainable. And so people like to talk about the graduation problem from these clouds a lot. And what it really is just that, and there's like 3 companies making money between you and the actual data center probably.
Yeah, it's really challenging. It's nice to use these tools that have these wonderful layers of abstraction that can be very nice until you hit that ceiling. And then you need to go beyond that. And for those platforms who need to, make this profitable, that's a challenge for them too. And I say this with like, all the compassion in the world because I worked at 2 other of these platforms, and yes. I saw what happened when they had to like get rid of free tiers and stuff like that. Like you got to make money somehow, and it is challenging. It's not to say that it's not valuable to people,
Right.
but there's a trade-off.
What happens when you build on top of that is all of a sudden, if you want to move off, you have to figure out how to replicate some assumptions you made. So like we started and we never had EBS. So we built things in a certain way that works for us that I think makes us more nimble. But I'm trying to imagine a world where we started at EBS and then moving to something like physical servers would have been really, really hard at that point. But yes, this is the plug for us. Is like we started on physical hardware, so our prices are actually within spitting distance of AWS. It's funny to be talking about this, watching Rails conf happen, because the Rails people are very anti. They're calling it the merchants of complexity is the words they're using, but I think they're really kind of dismissive of what it takes to like keep a database running well, for example, or to keep a load balancer healthy. And I think one of the things that they're doing that happens to me too, and I think happens to all of us, is we get to where we understand everything well enough that when something breaks, we'd rather it be in our control. I sort of get the draw of it. And the complexity thing is real. Like EBS I just described in AWS is like incredibly complex because it's not for one person. It's for millions of people. And the amount of engineering that went into that to make it work well was necessary because of how complicated it was. One of the things we've done since we were a small cloud starting on our own hardware is we're relatively simple, I think, compared to other places. Like we don't use Kubernetes because Kubernetes is really complicated and getting it to do what we needed was more complicated than building something simpler and making it work. Now we're selling Kubernetes to people because they want to use it, but we don't use it ourselves. Oh, they have a no PaaS slide. That's funny. I'm really fascinated with this because I think Rails has been really influential for like all apps that have been built in the last 15 years.
Very much so.
And I think the interesting question is whether this is they're still that influential.
The rise of not just Vercel, but serverless and JavaScript-centric apps changed a lot of how people choose to build their application.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm always like, Vercel's really big and fun to criticize, but this slide just like, Vercel's just AWS with 500% markup is just like completely ignoring all the things Vercel does.
Right. It does add a lot of value. It's interesting, when you were talking about Basecamp, could someone do a case study of when does it make sense to start with something that's really just a layer on top of AWS with a bunch of markup? At what point does that stop providing value so you decide to go to just pure AWS?
Right.
And then how far do you go just in AWS to where that no longer makes sense and you're like, no, we're just going to have our own data centers?
No, it's fun to talk about. I have guesses. I'm trying to think of when I would make these choices. Well, and a lot of what I'm complaining about with clouds is that I'm a developer and I don't want to operate infrastructure as a service. So like Vercel solves this problem for me, which means I starting a new project, or me and my two besties starting a new project, something like Vercel makes a ton of sense. I don't know. I feel like spending $100 a month on like a thing, like a project you're doing for real is just not that much relative to like the time you're putting into it. One of the things that Vercel does that you can't on AWS and that we do that you really can't on AWS is you can deploy an app that doesn't get used and it costs almost nothing. Versus if you put something directly on AWS, there's like a minimum price it's going to cost to run that thing. And so I think that's the thing that, sure, you can get a server from Hetzner for like $50 a month, but that's still not nothing.
That's still more than zero. There is a cost that is eaten on your behalf that allows it to stay that affordable.
Yeah, but I think the really dirty secret of most of these clouds is they make a lot of money on data out on egress. That's I get all violently angry about antitrust issues when I actually think about that specific thing that AWS and GCP and Azure bill for, because they charge that's like probably almost pure margin for them. There's not a lot of expense. There's not a lot of marginal cost to sending another gigabyte of data out of AWS. But they keep those prices high in a lot of ways because they have the market power to do that, and because it keeps people from leaving their
I was gonna say traps you.
Yeah, it really does. I was trying to think of who. We worked with Tigris, and Tigris will let you put Tigris in front of an S3 bucket, so you can at least spend money over time pulling stuff out of S3. But you're still paying for every file to come out of S3 to Amazon. But it's expensive, and it's like, well, if we were to move off S3, there's a huge upfront cost to doing that. There's no alternative. You can send disks full of information to Amazon because they want you to have their information, but they will not just send you hard drives of your crap back. It's just like not a thing that you can pay.
Yeah, you can't send in a letter. Please mail me back my.
Right.
Yeah, no.
So I think that's the point when I'd be like, oh my God, I'm really kind of outgrowing this thing, is when particularly the bandwidth pricing was so obscene. It made it hard for me to make money off an app, especially an app in like the early days. And then on top of AWS, And we suffer from this too. One of the problems with clouds like AWS or us is in any given place, we kind of want a lot of capacity free for people to spin up new services on it. So we are building probably 40% more capacity than anyone needs. And I think for a lot of, when apps get mature and they're not growing explosively over the course of a year anymore, you don't benefit from that overhead because your app's not bursting anymore. And this is where Basecamp is. And then the interesting thing is like Basecamp's pretty simple, but I think a lot of apps would be really pretty complicated to pull off of a cloud once they're that mature.
Yeah, that's sort of the sticky part of it all, right? Is that sure, it's easy to get up and running, but once you get to a certain scale, trying to migrate off to something that will be more affordable in the long term in itself is a huge cost.
And then the dirty secret again is CDNs. Like Basecamp's still using a CDN. I think we probably us and Cloudflare took it to more of an extreme than Vercel, and definitely more of an extreme than Render, but it's a thing that like I think newer clouds have acknowledged. This is mostly just because AWS modeled itself after how companies were using data centers, and companies rarely ran 2 data centers in 2 different parts of the world. And so what AWS ended up with is a thing where it's too complicated and too expensive to run multi-region for most apps. When I pitch this to investors, it's effectively impossible for a team of developers to do this. It's like, in theory, you could make this work on AWS, but it's just not really feasible because you have to build so much stuff to even manage like how your app gets deployed.
Gosh, do you really think it's that complicated?
So like one of the interesting things I talked about VPCs is AWS VPCs are regional. They're not like if you create a VPC in Virginia,
they're regional.
Be part. Yeah, and so you end up having, and they have tools to do all of this now, but it's still like what you're doing is stringing together a lot of their infrastructure tools to make this stuff work. What we found, I think, though, is that it's not like a thing they go looking for as much as it's a thing that just makes sense once they've used a cloud that you can do this on. AWS just doesn't, they're not building this stuff for devs like we are. So it's really hard, really, really hard. And it's really hard because data's hard. I think that's the biggest thing is nobody's figured out how to do a database globally yet.
Yeah. I have a video on this.
Yeah, right. And then we went like the stupid simple route, which actually works surprisingly well, like way better than I expected. But then like the smart people about databases like that can't possibly work because it's just it's like too out of left field. I think it's like that can't possibly work for enough apps. It's like it really does. It actually works. It's actually fine. Yeah. Shockingly useful.
I did like read that method and I was like, what? Are we allowed to do that? Are we allowed? What? Why is our VPC? Like, how are we able to do that so much better?
Well, it's like if cloud sucks, why do we?
If cloud suck, we've trash talked. We've trash talked enough.
What doesn't suck is the user experience for Heroku and Vercel and these things. Like as a developer, that's how I want things to work. And so when we were building Fly, there's this weird chasm between public clouds and like the PaaS type layer, where public clouds have a lot of ways you can implement best practices for things like networking. Like you really don't want your database available on the public internet. And Heroku just put your database on the public internet.
Yeah, they did.
They just ignored this problem.
I was in the support team, and the number of times I got people saying like, why am I getting these like random requests where people are just trying to use like root as user and root as password? And
well, I think what we did when we built Fly was we sort of like, well, you definitely need private networks to run interesting applications because you want, like when I wanted my search index, I wanted to be able to talk to it over a private network. It wasn't like it was like I want everything on a private network because my life is so much better that way. It's really convenient to like have things kind of talk trusted like that. And so we were like, obviously we're going to do something private networking. Otherwise apps can't cluster, like especially when we started working at Phoenix apps, otherwise they can't talk to each other, much less other services. And so it was more like, well, we have to have that because that's the best way to run an app, but we also like this experience. And so I think most of Fly is here's the primitive a cloud would offer, and here's the way we can give developers a good user experience on top of it. One big departure we made from AWS is like people who deploy an app on Fly probably don't know or care about the private network right away. They don't have to think about it. It's just there. But then they start doing things, and this is where the Heroku pressure comes in. Is like, well, I want to connect to my database now, or I want to SSH. I want to like connect to my Rails console, which is effectively like an SSH type thing, which you've spent a lot of time with. But what we ended up doing is having to build a lot of private networking features that let you do things like connect to your Postgres from your local computer to maintain the like UX that we think is correct. And this is when I say AWS sucks, it's because like I can't just connect to my RDS database that's on a private network. I have to do a lot of dumb ceremony to make that work, and I think that's stupid. I think in a lot of ways, like Heroku defined a really good UX, Amazon defined a really good set of like infrastructure primitives, and we've like built with those primitives and made the UX similar to what Heroku offered. But I think one of the philosophies that I've always had is like, I hate abstractions I don't understand, and I hate abstractions I can't get away from. And so like the whole platform, like all of the abstractions we have are actually relatively easy to turn off or go away from. Like you can just
there's not much.
There's not, which I think well, first, it's the only way we could build this sort of thing. We could not build something as complicated as VPC. We couldn't be running like NAT gateways or all of the weirdo stuff that Amazon pulls off at their scale. And so we just had to do simpler things. And so we've got people running CockroachDB because we give them enough primitives to be able to pull that off, which I think is really cool.